Welcome. My name is Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Foley Institute. On behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to our event with Keith Whittington. Today, I want to apologize for the mix-up we had with scheduling the room. We thought we had Spark scheduled, and apparently some engineering group thought they had it scheduled, and they were in there before us, so they got it. Before I introduce our guest, I just want to tell you a little bit about the Foley Institute, a little bit about the Distinguished Lecture Series, which Keith is part of. So the Foley Institute, as many of you may or may not know, was established in 1995 here at WSU to honor the service of Tom Foley, who was a representative here in the 5th Congressional District for 30 years, wound up being Speaker of the House of Representatives, and then went on to become U.S. Ambassador to Japan as well. And the institute that bears his name continues his legacy of integrity and commitment to public service through a variety of programs that aim at educating the public about democratic institutions and getting young people involved in careers in public service. We do a lot of interesting things here. If you want to know more about us, I encourage you to go to our webpage, like us on Facebook, send us an email. We'll send you lots of information about our upcoming programs and events. The Foley Distinguished Lecture Series recognizes Mr. Foley's belief that the critical challenges of the 21st century can only be met through innovative thinking and informed civil dialogue. Some of our previous distinguished lectures have included luminaries like DNC Chair and Presidential Candidate Howard Dean, New York Times journalist Nicholas Kristof, U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft, NAACP President Kwasi Mfume, as well as political scholars like Mo Fiorina from Stanford and Theda Skocpol from Harvard, as well as accomplished writers and social commentators like Christopher Hitchens and Chris Hedges. Tonight's distinguished lecture comes at a particularly critical juncture in American constitutional development. Whatever we think about the administration's policy, there's little doubt now that President Trump has challenged the norms of his office like no other modern president in recent history. In the wake of the Mueller report, the House of Representatives has now launched a series of investigations into alleged misconduct by the president and others in his administration. And just yesterday, the president said that he will not cooperate with those investigations and will prevent members of his administration from doing so. Many Democrats, including many who are running for the presidency, want to see the House, for only the 4th time in its history, begin a formal impeachment inquiry. Republicans so far resist these calls, and the public appears to be deeply divided on the issue. So, it certainly appears that we are in the midst of a constitutional crisis. But how do we know? And what does that really mean? And can history tell us something about our situation today and how we might avoid deepening this crisis if indeed that's what we are in? Fortunately, I can think of no person better to address some of these questions than my friend and our speaker tonight, Keith Whittington. Keith serves as the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Politics at Princeton University. He has published widely on American constitutional theory and development, judicial politics, and the presidency. His many books include Constitutional Construction, Divided Powers and Constitutional Meaning, Constitutional Interpretation, Textual Meaning, Original Intent, and Judicial Review, Judicial Review and Constitutional Politics, The Political Foundations of Judicial Supremacy, which won the Herman Pritchard Award for Best Book in Law and Courts and the David Greenstone Award for Best Book in Politics and History. And his most recent book, which was published just last year by Princeton University Press, Speak Freely, Why Universities Must Defend Free Speech, which won the Prose Award for Best Book in Education. And I was tempted to have him come talk about free speech on campus, but we had one of his co-authors and one of my former co-authors speak about that topic last year, Howard Gilman. So instead, I've asked Keith to come and talk about his current book project, which is a book entitled Constitutional Crises, Real and Imagined. In addition to being a prolific author, Keith has been a John M. Olin Foundation Faculty Fellow, an American Council of Learned Societies Fellow, a National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement Fellow, a visiting scholar at the Social Philosophy and Policy Center, a visiting professor at the University of Texas School of Law. He's also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Please join me now in giving Keith Whittington a warm to the road.
Thank y'all very much. I appreciate y'all coming out for this today. I know it's the end of the semester for you, so a difficult time for many to come out for stuff like this, and I particularly appreciate y'all being willing to go find the new forum in which we're now housed. to talk about what I think are quite important and interesting constitutional issues. There's lots of interesting things surrounding the Trump administration, including lots of interesting constitutional issues surrounding the Trump administration, some of which raise issues I think that are relatively familiar for those of us who've been paying attention to the developments in constitutional law and presidential power over time, some of which though are quite new and relatively unfamiliar, and suddenly the Trump era has brought to the fore issues that some of us would have thought were dead and buried and not things to talk about. But suddenly we find ourselves talking about them again. So I wound up this semester teaching a class on constitutional difficulties in the age of Trump, in part because it seemed like there were so many weird constitutional issues to talk about surrounding the president that it made sense to try to organize a whole class around them and sort of focus on the many unconventional things the Trump administration is doing and claiming and the kind of rhetoric that surrounds it, but also the ways in which some of the unfamiliar and weird things the Trump administration is doing, some of the bold claims it's making about constitutional authority, are also grounded in and rooted in larger developments in American politics and American constitutionalism over time. So not only to think about the ways in which Trump is relatively unique, but also the ways in which Trump is really just an extension of the kind of politics that we've seen growing over the past few years and few decades. And thinking about this particular topic, constitutional crisis, I think fits that mold as well. That is, Trump is a useful vehicle for thinking about issues of constitutional crisis more generally. It has led to a spate of political rhetoric around the notion of constitutional crisis. We are told repeatedly that we're in the middle of a constitutional crisis, although the particular targets of why exactly we're in the middle of a constitutional crisis keep moving over the course of the Trump administration. But I originally came to become interested in this topic of constitutional crisis because this is a claim that people have been making for quite some time. If you look across the 19th century and early 20th century of American constitutional politics, it's a little striking the extent to which people do not talk in the rhetoric of constitutional crisis. And that's just not the language that they used to think about the kind of constitutional problems that they confronted. And in part it reflected a greater confidence that they had in the robustness of their constitutional institutions and their ability to adapt to new and sometimes challenging political situations. In the latter part of the 20th century, by contrast, rhetoric about constitutional crisis has become much more prominent and much more common. In fact, we often trot out the claim that we are stepping up to a constitutional crisis or that we're in the midst of a constitutional crisis around a whole host of issues. And partially I was interested in why we're engaged in this kind of rhetoric and what it is people are trying to say when they're engaged in this rhetoric and what are the risks involved in talking in these terms about the Constitution. In part I was interested in the ways in which this kind of rhetoric surrounding our constitutional politics can be very misleading about how our constitutional politics actually works and how our constitutional system works in general. And I found it particularly disconcerting because part of what I had studied over time were moments of great constitutional struggle in American history, and the ways in which those moments of struggle in which we did innovative things with constitutional institutions and we debated about fundamental understandings about how the constitutional system is organized and ought to be organized going forward. Those moments of constitutional struggle have been incredibly important to guide our future as how our American constitutional system operated, and yet it's exactly those kinds of events that we are now tempted to want to label to be constitutional crises, that we want to characterize as so extraordinary and dangerous that we shouldn't engage in them. So for example, I, in my dissertation in grad school, studied a topic that I thought was of purely academic interest and would not be of interest to anyone outside of academia, and that was impeachments, including presidential impeachments. And then shortly after I graduated and I was moving that dissertation into a book, Bill Clinton got himself impeached. And suddenly, for the first time in 100 years, we were talking about presidential impeachments and how we ought to think about them. And surrounding that impeachment effort around Bill Clinton was an extraordinary conversation as well about constitutional crisis. That many claim that the fact that you were trying to impeach the President of the United States was itself a constitutional crisis. And moreover, the scandal surrounding the Clinton administration broadly should be understood as a kind of constitutional crisis. And that seemed particularly problematic to me, in part having studied presidential impeachments and really impeachments more generally across American history. Impeachments often did very important work within our American constitutional system. We had impeachments as a power that was given to Congress within the Constitution for particular reasons. And it was used for reasons, and we needed to be able to use them when a moment was right to be able to use the impeachment power. But moreover, historically, impeachments have done important work in changing our understanding about how constitutional institutions ought to operate. And if we tried to take basically the impeachment power off the table by saying that if we ever turned to use this particular political tool, it was somehow a crisis as an indication the constitutional system was collapsing and falling apart, and as a consequence we should never reach for this tool, then we're going to lose something important in how our constitutional system had in fact worked over time and ought to work going forward. And I think we find ourselves in a similar situation now where it's our temptation to want to label things as being crises, and as a consequence suggest that we shouldn't make certain kind of moves within the constitutional political process. We shouldn't use certain kinds of constitutional tools because they're unfamiliar. They seem extraordinary, they're rare, they're unconventional, and we often have a great deal of fear then of those things that we're not terribly familiar with. It's politics out of the ordinary, and that politics out of the ordinary makes us nervous, and it can make us nervous in ways that makes us fear for the Constitution in ways that we probably shouldn't. It makes us think our constitutional system is more fragile than in fact is. It can make us reluctant to use some of the constitutional tools that we in fact have available to us to help make our constitutional system work better. So I think it's important to try to unpack then this notion of constitutional crisis and try to think it through a little bit. And my bottom line in thinking about this is in part to suggest that we shouldn't be as worried as we are about constitutional crises. We should be more careful about how we think about this problem of constitutional crisis and less tempted to use the rhetoric of constitutional crisis. But at the same time, some of the things we are concerned about now and some of the constitutional issues that we're being exposed to now do suggest that there are genuine problems within our constitutional system that we ought to be thinking about fairly carefully. And there is some cause to worry about the future, even if we are sometimes a little too panicky about the present. But of course, in our present moment, we're particularly worried about President Donald Trump, and as a consequence, many fear that there is a constitutional crisis that might surround him. And there's lots of reasons to worry about Trump and why the Trump presidency is giving rise to these kinds of concerns in our particular moment. Like I said, I think we're operating against a background in which people are pretty quick to start declaring we're in a constitutional crisis anyway. They will trot that out in lots of presidencies, and we've seen that kind of political rhetoric in lots of instances in the past. But Trump does give rise to some particular reasons why people might be tempted to want to use this rhetoric. He is he was an unconventional presidential candidate in the first place. He came from an unusual background relative to most of our presidents. He had an unusual set of qualifications. He lacked the kind of traditional experience in Washington, D.C. and national politics, and even in politics more generally, that we often expect to see out of presidents. And as a consequence, he's more unpredictable than we might think the average president is. And he comes to the office with a different set of interests and concerns and expectations than a traditional presidential candidate would. And there's good reasons then to be nervous about those kinds of presidential candidates and what they might do when they occupy a high office like the presidency. That's true about Trump, and that would also be true of other kinds of presidents who might come to the presidency from that kind of unconventional background. But moreover, Trump also embraces lots of unconventional political rhetoric. He's willing to say things that others are not willing to say. Some of this he frames as sort of being willing to engage in a straight talk that most politicians are not. He's not going to hide the ball in a way that a traditional politician would. And so some of this is being framed as something more frank than other politicians. But it's no doubt true that he's engaging in lots of rhetoric, willing to talk about things and not only in sort of substance, but also in form that's radically different than other presidents do, and thus gives rise to lots of concerns about ways in which he might be shaking the foundations of the constitutional system more generally. It's also true that Trump comes to office with a set of policy ideas that were outside the mainstream of what American politics mostly revolved around up until his presidency. He's put in play a set of substantive views on certain substantive issues that were not being taken as seriously as they now have to be taken as a consequence of his political success. And again, anytime anyone comes to this kind of powerful office with a set of policy ideas, they're really challenging the status quo in terms of what we think is on the table, what we think is off the agenda for policy making in Washington. It raises challenges for how the constitutional system is going to respond to that. And of course, notably, Trump plays up a particular populist demeanor, which is quite unfamiliar for presidents. So if you look across the American presidential history, it's very hard to find a figure that is quite the same as Donald Trump in how they occupied the office, how they conducted themselves more generally, the kinds of experiences, but also attitude that they brought to bear to the presidency. In some ways, he does harken back to presidents like Andrew Jackson, for example, who comes outside of mainstream politics, comes from a military background rather than primarily a political background, although he had lots of experience relating to national politics as a consequence of that military background. Comes from the geographic frontier of the nation rather than from the center of the nation. As a consequence, Jackson likewise shook up the political system in the 1830s and 1840s in ways that previous presidents had not behaved very differently in the White House than other presidents did, and as a consequence gave rise to lots of fears about what the consequences of bringing somebody like that into office might be. Andrew Johnson, who found himself impeached after the Civil War during the Reconstruction eras, in some ways embodied some of this as well, that Andrew Johnson had been a populist figure as a politician in Tennessee prior to eventually be named vice president in the Lincoln administration and rising to the presidency upon Lincoln's assassination. And it's partially because of his particular substantive commitments at the time. He was hostile to much of what the Reconstruction Republicans were trying to do after the Civil War, but also because of his populist approach to the office and how he wanted to treat the presidency and use presidential powers was out of line with what mainstream politicians expected at the time. Johnson, too, shook up the American political system in very fundamental ways and eventually brought on his own impeachment by those Republicans who wanted to push back not only on his substantive commitments, but also in what he represented about the style of politics he was engaged in and how he wanted to use the presidential office more generally. Trump's not quite the same as an Andrew Johnson or an Andrew Jackson. He brings different skill sets and different kinds of rhetoric to the table. But in some ways, those are, I think in many ways, the closest analogs to Donald Trump in terms of the kind of unconventional approach they take to American politics and the ways in which they challenge the existing constitutional political system and how it tends to operate. So how should we think about this idea of constitutional crisis? So like I said, there's lots of rhetoric surrounding this notion. Lots of people are very quick to assert that we're in a constitutional crisis or we're at risk of constitutional crisis. But what's striking about a lot of this rhetoric is how ill-defined it is. And so not only does the claim that we're in a constitutional crisis arise amidst lots of different particular kinds of controversies, so we're attaching it to a whole wide variety of different events that might occur, but it's also never entirely clear what people think they mean when they say that we're in a constitutional crisis or what they think the implications of having said we're in a constitutional crisis might be. Mostly they just mean this seems unfamiliar and it seems very bad about how the system works, and that's fine. That tells us something at least, although it's an odd bit of rhetoric to turn to just because you're uncomfortable with the politics of the moment. But that seems to be part of what people want to mean when they're talking about a constitutional crisis. Notably, the idea of a constitutional crisis has no real legal significance. It's not a concept that's recognized within American constitutional law, has no pedigree in that regard, and such that it doesn't fit within a particular kind of constitutional framework. But I think it's nonetheless a concept that's worth unpacking a little bit and trying to think about, well, what might we mean by a constitutional crisis? What should count as a constitutional crisis? And what are the implications of using this kind of rhetoric? What is it people are reaching for when they are thinking that we might be in a constitutional crisis? What are the concerns that they're trying to express with that kind of rhetoric? And how seriously should we take those concerns? So I think the best way of trying to think about a constitutional crisis that sort of makes sense of some of the rhetoric and how it emerges within our political system as a whole is to think about constitutional crisis as a way of talking about a concern that the constitutional system itself seems to be failing. That we seem to be falling apart in terms of how the Constitution itself works. And this is a very fundamental problem about constitutions in general. There is this challenge for constitutions, not only in democratic systems, but also in authoritarian systems of various sorts, as to how do you make real-life politics, the actual politics of the day-to-day world, comport with a set of constitutional expectations, in our case, written down in a document, in some other cases, written in a much larger set of documents or in a set of ideals and commitments. How do you make actual politics comport with those constitutional requirements? We've seen lots of examples of constitutions that exist in the world in which if you read that constitution, it bears no relationship to actual politics and how it works. That the power is exercised in that society in a way that is completely disconnected from what the Baker document says about how the government ought to work and how the constitutional system ought to work more generally. And so one quite reasonable set of worries about a constitution is that possibility that our actual politics is going to become detached from what we think our constitutional commitments are. That the Constitution is no longer descriptive in a significant way about how politics actually operates, and it may no longer be prescriptive in the sense that no one may think that we ought to be behaving in a way that's particularly consistent with the Constitution. And I think we can break that down and thinking about then two different forms in which crisis can take for thinking about constitutions broadly in the American constitutional system in particular. One of which we might think of as a kind of crisis of operation, and the other I think we characterize as a crisis of fidelity. So let me take those in turn. By a crisis of operation, what I mean is that a constitution fails or fears that it's going to fail to be able to guide our actual politics, that we follow the constitutional rules and practices and guidelines and exercise constitutional powers in a way that we will in fact come to an impasse in which we are incapable of resolving our political disagreements and incapable of moving forward. Part of what constitutions are designed to do within a political system is to organize our disagreements such that it's possible for us to make collective decisions and then move forward with executing those decisions. And constitutions fail if they can't successfully do that, if they can't organize our politics in a meaningful way such that we can actually make decisions and move forward with them. So one concern about a constitution is that people are following the constitutional rules, but when they follow the constitutional rules, it simply leads to an impasse such that they're not capable of actually addressing some critically important social and political problems that they see in front of them, but instead the Constitution brings them to a standstill. The constitutional rules don't work in a very fundamental sense of leading us to what we want to accomplish. And in fact, we've seen some examples of things that look like that. The Articles of Confederation, the first federal constitution that we had, collapsed in part because of this kind of crisis of operation. There was a fundamental sense in which, for example, the United States needed to be able to pay its debts as a government. The federal government had accumulated a large number of debts during the Revolutionary period and continued to collect debts after the Revolutionary period. The Articles of Confederation famously did not include a mechanism for federal taxation. And moreover, it had a very high burden in order to amend that constitution. It required unanimity among the states before you can make any changes to that constitutional system. And as an effective consequence then, the federal government found itself in a position, the United States government found itself in a position in which they had accumulated significant debts to foreign bondholders and were incapable of paying them back, and were incapable of raising the funds necessary to pay them back. And there was no mechanism within the existing constitutional structure in which they could ever imagine how they would get out of that box and be able to successfully pay them back, because you needed to be able to adopt some kind of national revenue system that the constitutional design fundamentally prevented you from adopting. The consequence for the Articles of Confederation was then we abandoned it, right? That when the Constitution reaches that point where we're no longer capable within the terms of that kind of constitutional system to be able to make forward progress on this overwhelming social and political issue, there's a temptation then to simply abandon that constitutional system and step outside of it in order to move forward. In the case of the Articles of Confederation, that meant stepping outside of it entirely and creating an entirely new constitutional system, a constitutional system that empowered the federal government, for example, to raise taxes and being able to impose taxes then to actually pay national debts as a consequence of that. So that's sort of an extreme form of constitutional failure, and it's a constitutional failure that arises precisely because you can follow the constitutional rules, do the things the Constitution lays out, and yet not be able to address the political problems that confront you. But there are other kinds of examples of crises of operation that have arisen and threatened to arise within American constitutional and political history. One kind of example of that is thinking about the Secession crisis of the 1860s. So the Secession crisis raises this problem in part because it wasn't obvious what the correct response is when a set of states declare themselves outside the Union. through popular ratification. In fact, this was a problem that had already been encountered within the American constitutional system, not at the federal level, but at the state level. And it's a fundamental problem associated with the nature of popular sovereignty. That we think American constitutions gain their legitimacy and gain their existence from the fact that the people have declared them to be the constitution that they then want to live by going forward. And one of the challenges of constitutions rooted on the words of we the people and that kind of popular ratification of constitutions is how do we know when the people have actually ratified a particular constitution and given it legitimacy as opposed to something else. So for example, in Rhode Island in the 1840s, after an extended period in which activists in Rhode Island had worked to try to change the Rhode Island constitutional system in order to give more power, in particular to the people living in the western part of the state, like lots of other states in this period, population migrated to the west, and the existing constitution empowered people living on the East Coast, disempowered people living on the West Coast. This gave rise to lots of concerns over time about trying to change the Rhode Island Constitution. Unsurprisingly, those with power under that system were uninterested in changing how legislatures were apportioned and political power was allocated within that system. So eventually, the Western activists simply declared they were going to have their own constitutional convention, write their own constitution that was going to reform that system, and then ratify that constitution and elect a government under that constitution. And they did all those things. They held a popular convention. They held elections under that convention. They announced that constitution had been ratified by the people. It claimed legitimacy of the people, and then they elected a new governor and a new legislature. Meanwhile, the old governor and old legislature continued to exist under the old constitution. And then eventually the governors sent people out to arrest each other. Right? So eventually, Rhode Island found itself at a point where we had two competing governments claiming both to exercise power on behalf of the sovereign people in that state, both of whom were using guns to try to arrest the other side and saying, you're not the legitimate government, we're the legitimate government. Part of the challenge of any kind of constitutional system that's rooted on this claim of popular authority is, how do you know which, in fact, is the legitimate government under those circumstances? How do you know that this, is, in fact, is the right constitution and the right government that claims to act on behalf of the people and which one's not? James Madison confronted this problem in drafting the Constitution in 1787, and part of the challenge of moving that Constitution forward and replacing the Articles of Confederation was to convince enough people we ought to accept that new Constitution, form a new government under it, and claim that government as being legitimate, as opposed to the old Constitution that was formed under the Articles of Confederation, the old government that was formed under the Articles of Confederation. And that was a genuine political struggle, and not at all clear it was going to happen. Right? Entirely possible to imagine in 1787, as you're engaging that ratification process, the Anti-Federalists, for example, would refuse to recognize the legitimacy of the new U.S. Constitution and say, no, the only legitimate Constitution is the old Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, because after all, the new U.S. Constitution is not built in consistent ways with the procedures laid out in the Articles of Confederation about how you change constitutional forms. It violated those constitutional forms entirely. So a genuine challenge for the Federalists in trying to get the U.S. Constitution off the ground is how do you get people to recognize this as being the legitimate Constitution? And you can't appeal to the Constitution itself. In order to answer that question, you have to appeal to something in back of the Constitution. And the Rhode Islanders found themselves in that same situation in the 1840s, and other states, in fact, found themselves in very similar situations when they also confronted these kinds of problems of dissenting movements trying to form their own constitutions and hold elections under those constitutions. And the secession crisis is a version of that as well, where the southern states then declared, on the same basis of popular sovereignty, we now declare the right to pull ourselves out of the Union on the same basis that we declared our right to pull ourselves into the Constitution in the first place. And there's no mechanism in the U.S. Constitution that would allow you to resolve that dispute. There's no secession mechanism that lays out you either have the right to secede from the Union or you don't have the right to secede from the Union. It doesn't tell you what process you have to follow in order to recognize that dispute. And instead, you then had people on both sides, both inside the federal government and outside the federal government, who were genuinely struggling with trying to figure out, okay, how within the confines of our existing constitutional system do we resolve this particular dispute? And the answer was you couldn't. Right? At the end of the day, you just couldn't. There was nothing in the constitutional structure that provided a mechanism for resolving that dispute. And the result in that case was extreme, as the result was war. That's not always the case with a crisis of operation. We can see much more modest versions of that, where you follow the constitutional rules to the end of the road and you find yourself as a complete impasse. And one kind of example is in a persistent feature of our constitutional experience in this regard, comes in the context of nomination and confirmations. So built into our constitutional structure, right, is the fact that the president nominates officers to both the judicial and the executive branches of government. And the Senate has to confirm those officers, which gives you the possibility then that the Senate and the President can never come to agreement about who those officers ought to be, and instead seats simply sit vacant. And there's been a persistent problem within our constitutional system that sometimes arises, where presidents and senates simply cannot come to any kind of agreement about how to actually fill the offices of government that will allow the government to continue to operate. And in general, we've been able to move past these crises in part because we adopt a set of informal practices that allow us to work through these particular disputes, in part because the system is relatively robust, such that we can tolerate lots of vacancies within the system as a whole. So, for example, Chief Justice Roberts, not too long ago, declared that we were in a constitutional crisis precisely because there were too many vacancies in the lower federal courts. The Senate and President for the last 2 decades had not been able to agree on what judges ought to be appointed to the lower courts, and as a consequence, we were having increasing numbers of vacancies arising within those courts. One feature of the Trump administration and changes within Senate rules is we've overcome that. As a consequence, now Trump is rapidly filling exactly those kind of vacancies. But for a long period, there's a genuine concern on both sides of the political aisle that we were allowing vacancies to sit precisely because we had this constitutional structure that did not give us a way out when presidents and senates couldn't come to agreement. This may be a persistent feature going forward in our American constitutional system. So we figured out a way out of it in our current moment where we have a Republican Senate and a Republican President capable of filling these lower court vacancies. But it's very easy to imagine that instead we have divided government, such we have a party controlling the Senate that's different from the party controlling the White House, and we go back to not filling those vacancies not only at the lower court level, but also potentially at the Supreme Court level, and maybe at the extreme at the cabinet level as well. Right, so imagine a presidential administration. A new president gets elected. He sends nominees to fill his cabinet to the Senate. The Senate's controlled by the other party, and the other party refuses to confirm any of those nominees. Right, refuses to allow the president to have the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General that president wants. Historically, we've avoided that problem, not because there's a formal feature of the Constitution that prevents that problem from happening, but instead because the Senate has adopted a deferential attitude that said the president ought to get the Attorney General he wants. The president ought to get the Secretary of Defense that he wants. And the Senate ought to defer to those people except in extreme cases, such that normally speaking, the senator should sign off on it even if we have all kinds of disagreements with those people or those policies, etc. But deep partisan polarization can undermine that. Right? And we can find ourselves increasingly in a position in which senators wake up and say, we don't want to be particularly deferential. In fact, it'd be politically costly for us to be, for example, signing off on attorney generals that our voters and our activists and our supporters think are deeply problematic. And as a consequence, we will not be deferential to a president that signs that. And instead, we'll just allow vacancies to sit at the highest levels of the U.S. Government. Perhaps the system can operate despite that. But fundamentally, that's the kind of crisis possibility that the U.S. constitutional system builds in by having the kind of presidential system and kind of separation of powers that the American Constitution does. The other kind of crisis you might characterize as a crisis of fidelity. So this is not about that the constitutional system doesn't work very well. It's not about the fact that you might follow the constitutional rules and come to an impasse and not have any clear mechanism for moving forward and getting beyond that impasse. Instead, there's a possibility that we might just not want to follow the rules. Right? That there's a rule in the Constitution, there's a set of norms in the Constitution, a set of practices, institutions built in the Constitution that we just think are too problematic to continue to follow. And it's a crisis for the Constitution because we might come to the conclusion that we should stop following the Constitution. Maybe we stop following it in its totality, as we did with the Articles of Confederation, but maybe we just stop following these particular features of the Constitution. This particular rule we're just going to effectively excise and ignore, which would be a kind of constitutional crisis as well. Now, historically, the United States has tended to avoid that. And we avoid it in a variety of ways, in part because we become very creative about how we interpret the Constitution. So political movements that might be tempted to simply ignore the Constitution instead find ways of working within the Constitution by becoming creative about how they interpret it. It's part of how the Anti-Federalists reconciled themselves to the existence of the U.S. Constitution. So instead of continuing to fight the U.S. Constitution, and say, no, we're going to stick by the Articles of Confederation, we refuse to recognize the legitimacy of the new U.S. Constitution. Instead, the Anti-Federalists eventually said, okay, we can find a way of reconciling ourselves to the U.S. Constitution if we interpret it right. And we have a very different idea about how you ought to interpret it than the Federalists do, for example. And that's been a persistent feature of American politics over time, where potentially quite radical movements that might otherwise be tempted to reject the Constitution whole hog have instead been brought inside the tent because they can figure out a way in which they can engage in politics inside the Constitution by interpreting it in various ways. But we've had occasions when people don't think that's possible. Right? So for example, the Garrisonians, an abolitionist movement that was quite radical at the time, wanted to reject the Constitution in its entirety precisely because they thought there were features of the Constitution that were so deeply immoral, so embedded in the existing constitutional structure, that no legitimate government could continue to reconcile themselves with those institutions, and they ought to simply ignore it. So the emphasis of the Garrisonians then as a political movement was to say, we ought to reject this Constitution entirely and withdraw from it as a consequence. Right? Notably, other abolitionists took a different view, instead took a view that no, we can interpret the Constitution correctly in a way that's more consistent with the anti-slavery movement in general. Abraham Lincoln eventually comes out of that wing of the abolitionist movement that says, in part, we can interpret this Constitution in a way that's more consistent with our moral commitments. And moreover, we can accept the idea that we can amend that Constitution and change it so we can work within it in the near term in order to try to change it more dramatically in the long term. On the other hand, the Garrisonians, much more radical movement, wanted to say none of those solutions are adequate, and partially the Constitution survives precisely because the Garrisonians remain a marginal movement and the abolitionists figure out an alternative way of building a national coalition that's consistent with the Constitution rather than a national coalition that requires rejecting the Constitution. So we see this kind of example of radical movements like the Garrisonians who look at the existing constitutional system and say it's gone so far off the rails we have to reject it in its entirety. And that's one kind of movement. Those tend not to be highly successful. They tend not to be able to win national office, and as a consequence they remain marginal in our American politics. But the other kind of concern is not this kind of concern of movements being organized around the idea that we need to reject the Constitution, but instead politicians have come to the conclusion that I can't achieve my goals in a manner that's consistent with the existing Constitution. Right? And one alternative to that, of course, is to say I have to give up my goals because the Constitution takes priority over my particular political goals. But the other move you make is to say, no, it turns out actually I ought to abandon the Constitution in this case. I should ignore the Constitution in this case because my goals are in fact so critically important they have to be advanced. In this situation, the Franklin Delano Roosevelt found himself in the midst of the Great Depression. So that's not in the context in which we tend to focus our attention of thinking about the Court Packing Plan and what emerged after 1936 and the debates of 1937, where FDR says we need to change the court in order to get the court to interpret the Constitution in a way that's consistent with what I'm trying to accomplish in the New Deal. But instead, I'm thinking of an earlier conflict that arose between FDR and the court, which is over the Gold Clause cases. So one thing that FDR did during his early stage of his presidency is to suspend the federal government's willingness to repay debts in gold. The difficulty for the federal government is they'd entered into all kinds of contracts in which they were required to repay debts in gold. They'd issued, especially during World War I, a set of national bonds that promised that those bonds would be repaid with gold, not just with dollars. But the problem is, of course, fundamentally, the United States did not have enough gold to actually pay all that back during the Great Depression. So part of what Roosevelt did when he came to office was to suspend those gold payments. Unsurprisingly, the bondholders sued the federal government and said, no, we've got a contract, you've got to pay it back in gold. The Constitution requires you pay your contracts, and brought this to the court. The court hears the case. The court's clearly very sympathetic to this notion that the federal government actually has to pay off on its contracts. In this case, a contract that requires payments in gold. The administration primarily makes an argument to the court, it would be economic ruin if you make us do this. Not primarily a legal argument that says, in fact, the Constitution doesn't require us to repay in gold, but instead to emphasize to them the policy consequences, the economic consequences if you actually make us adhere to this. Meanwhile, Washington, D.C. is filled with public discussion about what happens if the court rules against the administration. And the Attorney General goes on record saying he doesn't know how far he'd have to go if the court goes against the administration, for example. So privately, he advises Roosevelt it may be necessary to disband the court if they go against us. In public, the rumors are we might have to declare martial law. We might have to arrest the justices. We might have to engage in court packing under these circumstances. Roosevelt himself has a speech prepared in case the court rules against him, in which he's prepared to go on radio and declare that I have a higher priority than obeying the court under this context, and I will have to not comply with the judicial order requiring me to start paying gold because the economic consequences would be too severe. Roosevelt never has to give that speech. He never has to give that speech because the court blanks. So the court issues an opinion in which they say, in fact, the Constitution requires you pay your contracts in gold, but they find a technical out such that it's not possible for the bondholders to successfully get a judicial order that will require that. So the justices lecture the administration, you should pay back in gold as much as you can, but unfortunately our hands are tied, we can't actually issue a direct order forcing you to pay in gold. And the administration walks away with that victory. If that case had come out a different way, Roosevelt would have issued that speech that he had prepared, in which he would have simply said, there are features of our Constitution that's inconsistent with what the demands of the nation are at the moment, and as a consequence, we have to set them aside. This is not a function of creative interpretation. There's not a way in which we can make things work more smoothly or take a different approach to thinking about the Constitution than the justices are taking, which is the kind of argument he makes in 1936 and 1937. But instead, in the context of the Gold Clause, he simply says, yes, I recognize the Constitution actually requires this action. I can't take that action. And as a consequence, we have to ignore the Constitution. A genuine crisis of fidelity in that context. So as we think about the Trump administration, the issues that arise during the Trump presidency, the question arises, are we likely to encounter either one of those kinds of issues, either that kind of crisis of fidelity or a crisis of operation? And I think there are some reasons to worry about both. Right? Partially, as I suggested already, this kind of deep partisan polarization plays on the way our separation of powers is structured and what the constitutional mechanisms look like about how we resolve impasses between the executive branch and the congressional branch. So, for example, one of the things that we are now immediately declaring constitutional crises about is the fact that Trump is threatening not to recognize, the Trump administration is threatening not to recognize subpoenas being issued by congressional committees to recover documents and have witnesses come testify to those congressional committees. This is, in fact, another one of these areas where there's been longstanding conflict between the executive branch and the congressional branch about how to deal with the fact that Congress will sometimes issue subpoenas to the executive branch doesn't want to comply with in various ways. And generally speaking, the Constitution doesn't provide clear rules about how we reconcile those issues and how we work through them. Instead, we have found political accommodations in the past to work our way through them. In our current moment, with this deep polarization between the two parties, there is an instinct instead to try to heighten those conflicts. Right? To do not say, okay, how can we work this out? What kind of informal negotiated compromise can we come to in which both sides get a little bit of what they want, but not everything that they want? But instead, there's a tendency to want to dig in, to insist that I will give you nothing, and I demand everything on the other side. Fundamentally, the Constitution doesn't provide an out for this, except for the possibility that eventually elections will resolve the conflict. Eventually, a new administration will be elected, or a new Congress will be elected, in which these issues will retreat. Right? But it highlights the possibilities in which political polarization can play on, in particular, our separation of powers concerns, such that things that we have in the past worked out largely informally become increasingly difficult to work out informally, and the constitutional structure itself doesn't provide a good mechanism for resolving in a very clear, very immediate way. And the question usually then becomes, how big are the stakes? How much of a problem does it create if, in fact, we can't resolve these particular kinds of impasses that might arise between the Congress and the President, for example? It's also possible to imagine, at least, instances in which we have a crisis of fidelity as well. That is, there may be features of the Constitution that, for example, the administration refuses to recognize as legitimate and binding on him. And I think what's more reassuring in this context is it's unlikely that any large segment of either political party is going to embrace that kind of solution. So while it's relatively easy to imagine, for example, President Trump either not knowing what the Constitution requires or not caring what the Constitution requires, such that he would insist upon trying to do things that are in fact quite inconsistent with the Constitution itself. That's not so true of other members of his administration, not so true of the Republican Party coalition more generally. And so the question becomes not just, well, what will this individual do in response to the president and in response to the Constitution? To what extent will this particular individual feel like the Constitution shouldn't continue to be binding? But instead, what does a set of political supporters, they're an important part of a larger political coalition, think about the Constitution? Do they feel bound by the constitutional rules more generally, or are they willing to cast it aside more broadly? And I think one thing we've seen that's somewhat reassuring about the nature of the Trump administration, that while Trump himself might well rage against features of the constitutional system or features of the legal system more generally, while some of his supporters may well join him in those frustrations, others of his supporters push back. in part because they see value in constitutional stability, they see value in these constitutional rules and sustaining them over time, that in ways will tend to rein in Trump's own particular instincts. But again, this crisis of fidelity, we should worry about to some degree precisely because crises of fidelity arise when we think that our political goals are so important that it's worth potentially sacrificing the immediate confines of the Constitution in order to achieve those goals. And in this context of heightened partisan polarization, it may become increasingly the case where we think that what we're trying to accomplish politically is in fact so valuable that that will override our interest in sustaining this sort of long-term, much more abstract, much more nebulous concerns about adhering to particular sets of constitutional rules. So I think we're often too quick to declare constitutional crises. We have a tendency to want to declare a constitutional crisis when we really shouldn't, in part by short-circuiting constitutional provisions and features that are in fact important to how our constitutional system works more generally. But there are tendencies within modern politics that ought to make us a little nervous about how well they can overlap with the way our constitutional system is designed and the way it might work in general. How well can our constitutional system operate with very intense partisan polarization for long periods of time into the future. The history of the United States suggests that we often find ways of overcoming these difficulties. We may have some dicey moments in the meantime, but in the long term, we tend to overcome them. But I think nonetheless, that shouldn't lead us to minimize too much the ways in which some of these tendencies can get out of hand, and some of these tendencies can ultimately lead us to not take sufficient care of our constitutional practices that are in fact crucial to making our constitutional system work more generally. Thank you.
Okay, so we have 20, 25 minutes or so for Q&A. Maybe I'll start us off. I suspect there's going to be lots of questions about Trump, so I won't ask a Trump question. What I didn't hear you talk about is constitutional norms.
Right.
So I want to ask you a question about the difference between a crisis that affects constitutional norms versus one that affects the Constitution proper.
Right.
You know, so it's one thing to say we have a crisis because polarization has led to lack of comity and lack of deference between the branches that should have. Another thing to say we have a constitutional crisis because the Electoral College is working the way it's supposed to work, and it repeatedly now produces a presidential election result that doesn't reflect the majority's will.
Right.
So is there any difference in those two types of crises?
Yeah, so I think there are differences. I mean, one of the interesting and useful things I think about the Trump presidency in this regard is it's focused our attention on the importance of norms and how our system works in general. In part because Trump is particularly willing to violate lots of norms that we otherwise would regard as unremarkable and not talk too much or think too much about, but in fact do important work within the system in general. I think sometimes it's worth then distinguishing between, well, look, are we violating, to what degree are we violating the Constitution itself, and to what degree are we simply violating a set of practices that have been built up around the Constitution that help grease the wheels of our constitutional mechanisms, but in fact, we could be doing it differently. And one feature of violating constitutional norms is a challenge to, are there different ways we could be doing it, and are there different ways we could be doing it that in fact are useful and effective for accomplishing what it is we want to accomplish more generally. But we want to be a little cautious, I think, about violating norms willy-nilly, in part because norms do serve a useful function within the constitutional system. To some degree, they help limit discretionary power, for example. So we build up constitutional norms in part by saying we're going to invest in a government official lots of discretionary authority, and then we're going to build up around that a set of norms about suggesting the president should, or other government officials shouldn't exercise all that discretionary authority, right? So it says that their legal power is much wider than what we think their practical attitudes and practical activities might be. So one of the issues I think surrounding, for example, Trump's declaration of a national emergency in order to help fund his border wall project goes to exactly that, right? To what degree is the question of what are the rules in place about how much discretionary authority do you have, and to what degree is the real issue here about a set of norms that are guiding how you ought to use that discretionary authority. The Constitution and statutes are in fact designed in this context to give the president lots of discretionary authority, and we've worked on a system in which we don't expect presidents to be playing that out to the maximum. And part of what Trump's willing to do oftentimes is figure out, okay, where are the boundaries of the rules, and let me push that as hard as possible. which puts a lot of pressure then on our ability to sort of operate within the constitutional system that we might operate on more generally. Some of these norms issues I think are also important to thinking about this. Partially the system, we develop a set of norms in order to make the system operate more effectively. So it's not only just about limiting power, but also helping to make the constitutional mechanisms that we have work more smoothly. So some of the ways in which we work around these separation of powers features, for example, where it's possible for the Senate and the President or Congress and the President to be at severe loggerheads, is through a set of norms about, okay, what do you do when you have these conflicts? How do we work through these conflicts in a way that sort of informally resolves them? And to the extent that those break down, we find ourselves falling back increasingly on, okay, what are the limits of our formal power here and how far can we press those? And if that's where we are, then the system becomes much clunkier and works much less effectively. And that's not just a question then of are we worried about our liberties collapsing or worried about democracy collapsing. Instead, it becomes an issue of do we worry about the government working smoothly and effectively if we lose those kinds of norms. And partially we're seeing, I think, those come under pressure because of Trump in particular. But some of these things are coming under pressure, I think, because of this sort of deeper partisan polarization where there's a real concern of to what degree do I want to continue to tie my own hands with a set of norms in order to cooperate with the other side that I don't, in fact, have much respect for, and I think, in fact, is like guiding the country in a radically wrong direction, for example. So maybe I should be more willing to bust some norms in order to exactly minimize their power and maximize my own power in order to take the country in a direction I think is valuable and important. That's a constant temptation in politics, but also something that tends to undermine these informal things that helps make the Constitution work more generally. Yeah.
I have a comment that leads to a question. During the Civil War crisis, the Secession crisis that you mentioned, Lincoln was forced to invent some extra constitutional powers, the war powers of the president, which aren't in the Constitution anywhere. And so on. That became a precedent for any later presidents. And since the example of Roosevelt that you mentioned, the crisis of the Depression, the collapse of the economy, and then World War II. And since that time, almost continuous war or Cold War has given rise to an extra constitutional evolution of an imperial executive at the expense of the powers of the legislature.
Right.
How do you see the Imperial Presidency under Trump playing into these current issues?
Yeah, so I think Trump is interesting in this regard. So, so a regular feature of my undergraduate constitutional law classes, for example, over recent years, has been an extended period of time talking about war powers and presidential war powers because it's so crucial to what the current constitutional system looks like and what the presidency is currently doing. One thing that's interesting about Trump is he's pushing on those boundaries much less aggressively than what the Obama administration did, the Bush administration did, the Clinton administration did, for example. War powers is less on the table now than it had been more generally, in part because Trump doesn't have those same policy ambitions and that same interest in pushing those forward than he otherwise would. He's enjoyed some of the benefits that he's inherited as a consequence of some of those actions, but he's not pushing on them as hard. In part, it'd be interesting if he pushed on them harder, as is true of like a lot of other features of the Trump administration. To the extent he pushes on them harder, it may encourage people to try to rethink, okay, how comfortable are we with the amount of presidential power that we've handed over and how much discretionary authority that we've given to presidents, and how much can we rethink that authority? Part of the challenge in the presidential power, in the war powers context, though, in particular, is that even those who are serious critics of presidential war powers and moreover serious critics of particular war that presidents are engaging in have had a very difficult time figuring out what the alternative is. And so it's been very hard to organize around some plausible, credible alternative that allows the United States to do what most Americans want it to do in the world and most political leaders want it to do in the world, while also tying the hands of the president very effectively. So the War Powers Resolution is an effort to try to thread that needle, and not a very good one. But in part it reflects the fact that Congress might be unhappy with the imperial president, but doesn't really have a good alternative as to how you design the system to do something else instead. But again,
could I just follow up with the imperial presidency I think, was born out of the need for war powers in the executive. But now it plays
Right.
in other ways. For example, government by executive order or by refusing legislative
Yeah.
subpoenas and so on.
Yeah, so I think really the problem, I think it's worth disentangling those, because I think the things that drive the war powers issue is really different than the things that are driving presidential discretion in executive orders, for example. The rise of the administrative state and what we want the government to be doing domestically has generated lots of opportunities for presidential discretion in the domestic policy-making sphere. That is, I think, distinguishable and driven by a different set of factors, and creates a different set of puzzles about how do you try to remedy that problem than what we are facing in the war powers context. And so it happens, I think, that they have moved along a similar track in a similar time period, and they both have added to presidential powers in their own ways. But I think they pose somewhat different constitutional problems and somewhat different political problems about how you might address them. So you can imagine, for example, a solution to the war power stuff that doesn't actually do much of anything relative to executive orders and national emergencies and whatnot, and vice versa, right? But they both are actually raise really serious challenges about, given how we've constructed our modern politics and what we want our modern state to do, is there a way of organizing it differently that does not, in fact, invest so much discretionary authority in the president in particular, or the executive branch more generally? And part of the challenge is it's actually really hard to figure out how do you have the kind of state that we want to have, or seemingly want to have, without investing the president with lots of authority, which makes it then particularly important about who you choose to be the president.
Yeah.
Under those contexts.
So to follow up on his question, if Lincoln had not got assassinated,
Right.
do you think there may have been a push from some to impeach him?
So I think Nixon was a savvier figure than Johnson was in terms of politics, but there would have been similar tensions. And so probably he wouldn't have been impeached. In part, he wouldn't have the same political weaknesses Johnson had, I think, and that made him politically vulnerable to getting impeached in the same way that Lincoln did. I think Lincoln was better situated to resist that. But Lincoln himself, I think, was already encountering, even before his assassination, the tensions of how powerful is the president going to be when we emerge out of the war period and are transitioning to peace. What is Reconstruction policy going to look like, and how do we resolve it? And there were going to be tensions inside the Republican coalition about how to resolve those things, in which Lincoln would have found himself having some of the same fights. I think the fights would look different. As a consequence, I doubt they would have led to an impeachment per se, but I think some of the struggles that Johnson had with the Congress were implicit in the situation, and Lincoln probably would have faced similar kinds of struggles himself. Probably resolved them somewhat differently, but it would have had a somewhat similar set of tensions anyway. Yeah.
Is the Federalist Society, is Trump going to cross the Federalist Society?
I wouldn't think so, but say more about what you're thinking about relative to that. And so one of the remarkable things I got to say about Trump is while he's mercurial in all kinds of ways, unpredictable in lots of ways, he's been remarkably willing to actually stick to this particular promise of appointing judges who are consistent with, so we used to characterize the Federalist Society, in part to delegate a lot of authority to those associated with the Federalist Society, and stuck to the campaign promises he made. He selected Supreme Court justices off the list, for example, and he stuck to the list. And he's done similar things in the lower courts. And so this is one area of his administration that he's been very consistent on, and it's a consistency that does not seem to be driven by his own particular commitments, but instead seems to be driven by a genuine sense on his part that he just needs to do it politically in order to keep his coalition together, and he doesn't care enough about it to want to do something else. And so he doesn't have the same temptation to back off of it that he might have in some other context. So no, I don't see him. I don't see him breaking that alliance anytime soon. And I think the challenge in some ways is whether the Federalist Society, and I mean, the Federalist Society is not a thing that's necessarily sort of driving the Trump administration. The people associated with the Federalist Society, who's associated with this, is a large network of lots of people who have disagreements, legally speaking. And strikingly, like lots of those people within that sort of intellectual movement associated with the Federalist Society have lots of disagreements about how Trump exercises political and constitutional and legal power, and have lots of skepticism about the kind of power he's exercising and the way he's exercising it, such that his interests and their interests don't fully align in terms of how he operates the presidency. They totally align on who he's appointing to courts, but does not align very well on some other things. Although interestingly, they do align on some other stuff. So there's lots of people associated with federal society, for example, who take a fairly expansive view of presidential powers, which works in his favor. And you see Attorney General William Barr, for example, articulating some of those principles. They're sort of widely held within the conservative legal movement, for example, that have positive implications for Trump in some of these contexts and some of the constitutional fights he's having with Congress, for example. But don't work in his favor in other kinds of contexts. But I suspect that's a partnership that will endure through the rest of his presidency, ultimately. And with increasing sniping probably from conservative lawyers outside the administration about the presidency, but probably not something that Trump himself is going to eventually abandon. I don't think he's going to appoint his sister to the Supreme Court, for example. I worried that he was, actually. It turns out he has not done that, and I don't think he's going to do that. Right? So I think he's going to stick to list, and that will probably endure the rest of his presidency, I suspect.
Professor Whittington, I have a question. Just to kind of summarize and encapsulate this whole discussion, my question is, it seems to me, well, let me start with a statement and then a question. It seems to me that the crisis of operation is much more threatening to the constitutional arrangement than the crisis of fidelity. And let me give you an example, and then I'd like to hear your comment on that, if you might. It seems to me that the secession crisis of the 1860, in fact, was threatening to the republic itself.
Right.
Whereas in terms of the crisis of fidelity, I mean, you're talking about, does DOJ, crack down on states that have legalized recreational marijuana? It seems like there's a real difference between those two types of crises. How do you view that?
So I think there's some truth in that. I think they both have really significant versions and relatively minor versions. And so you can imagine relatively minor sort of conflicts that are crises of operations, but are relatively minor in part because the stakes are just not that high and what's associated with them, and so as a consequence we can live with those conflicts, right? And so, and I actually think that the current subpoena issue with the Trump administration is like that, right? So that we can actually live with that conflict through the rest of his administration if push comes to shove, such that this may never get resolved, and that's okay. In a way that's not so okay if, for example, the Senate just refused to confirm any cabinet members of a future administration, for example, or the Supreme Court shrinks down to 3 justices because the Senate's never willing to confirm any nominations to the Supreme Court that the president's put forward. So I think there are more extreme versions and more minor versions, but I think that's also true at the level of fidelity. And so you can imagine extreme versions of fidelity in which you say, for example, I'm going to abandon the entire Constitution. But there's also extreme versions of fidelity in which case I'm not interested necessarily in abandoning the whole Constitution, but there's a particular feature that is pretty important that I'm going to set aside here. And so to pick up the sort of electoral college example, right? So for example, so imagine, there's a host of things actually associated with sort of thinking about presidential elections that might fall into that. So imagine you had a particularly popular person running for the president who was below the legal age to run for the president, or somebody who was not a natural-born citizen by any possible interpretation, right? And so instead we argue about sort of, is McCain really a natural-born citizen or not, right? But imagine Arnold Schwarzenegger, nobody thinks he's a natural-born citizen, right? And he runs for president and gets elected. Or you have this instance in which people just in fact refuse to accept that the person who wins the electoral college is the legitimate president because the person who wins the popular vote declares, no, I'm the legitimate president, I refuse to concede, and everyone goes along with that, for example. These are really significant features of the Constitution such that it makes a difference as to who our president is, right? And yet that would all be a crisis of fidelity in the sense that we're no longer willing to follow this particular constitutional rule. We are writing out of the Constitution. We're no longer willing to follow it because we really want Arnold Schwarzenegger to be our president, despite the fact he's not a natural-born citizen, because we just don't care about natural-born citizenship anymore.
So each has its role.
So each has its role, and I think both can have sort of say really important. There can be really important versions of these crises, but there can also be sort of, I think, very modest versions of these crises that really have no big ramifications. So, for example, I think one thing that probably effectively is a crisis of fidelity is the origination clause in the Constitution. So the origination clause requires that the House of Representatives originate revenue-raising bills. Now, the Founders Clause is important, that the popularly elected House be the one that starts the tax process. And instead, routinely, we have taxation bills that originate in the Senate. And instead, we make all kinds of dances around how do we technically sort of say, okay, this might have been like out of the House, but really, we all know it came out of the Senate. Effectively, we had written the origination clause out of the Constitution. Nobody thinks this is a serious thing we have to actually pay attention to, except in a very window dressing kind of way.
Obamacare was done that way.
Now, Obamacare is an example, but there's been lots of other examples as well. And so we have had the barest pretext of complying with the origination clause. Effectively, we don't recognize that as being a real part of the Constitution in terms of something that actually guides our real governmental practice. There are not big consequences to having written the origination clause out of the Constitution in effect. So I think that we have these sort of very minor sort of crises of fidelity that do in fact have this kind of crisis-like quality. They have the same conceptual form, but the significance of it politically is just not that big. And then there are obviously versions of that that would be very severe and very big and have very noticeable consequences for how American politics operates. So are students particularly? Sorry, I just want to make sure. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, I think the point of the Constitution is, maybe that was not discussed,
Mhm.
is it's an evolving concept. It is
Yeah.
a document that is physically put down, which is not always the case for all governments.
Right.
But the interpretation of the Constitution varies based on the area it's operating under. So the point, I think, at least that the person saying that Celine was raising about an imperial presidency was, is the president acting in an imperial manner, not necessarily external to the U.S., but internal,
Yeah.
meaning domestically, meaning overstepping certain
Sure.
bounds that people normally would not overstep because of the point of the Constitution having been rewritten over the Articles of Confederation for the purpose of enforcing checks and balances.
Mhm.
That way, one branch cannot overstep another branch, and then you don't have something that is no longer a democracy, which perhaps is the point of having a constitutional crisis, or why people are
Yeah.
calling it that, because that means that it's not doing its job to prevent that from happening, which perhaps is the issue at hand.
Yeah, no, so I think that'd be certainly part of what we worry about. And although part of the evolving feature of the Constitution is we've dramatically expanded presidential power across the 20th century in particular, although actually part of the late 19th century as well, for that matter. So when we think about sort of the Constitution as an evolving set of practices and expectations and rules, that partially plays out in the context of thinking about what kind of individual rights we have and how courts operate, but also plays out in the context of how the president operates and how presidential power operates more generally. And so part of what we're struggling with now, I think, is the fact that our Constitution has evolved in a way, our constitutional practices and our effective governing structures have evolved in a way that gives the president extraordinary discretionary authority. And sometimes that doesn't bother us very much because we sort of trust the president to make decisions. We mostly agree with the kind of stuff he's doing. We give him all that discretionary authority precisely because we want him to be able to make some kind of decisions that we think are important for us to make. And we want him to have the flexibility to be able to make those decisions. That becomes much less comforting when we have serious disagreements about what we ought to be doing with that discretionary authority. So that arose in the war powers context where people said, well, okay, fine, we're happy to let the president evolve and have lots of war-making powers in the context of the 1940s and 1950s, and when it comes to the Vietnam War, that seems a lot less attractive. And so as a consequence, we struggle with trying to figure out, okay, how do we pull this back then? Because now we don't agree anymore about how we ought to be using power in the international arena. And then they figured out it was really hard to pull it back. Hard to figure out how you would pull it back. And there's a similar issue in the domestic sphere as well, right, where we just had fundamental disagreements then about how we ought to be exercising the discretionary authority. And now I think we may be facing a similar issue that we thought about in the war powers context in the 1970s and late 1960s of, okay, is there a way we can imagine that we sort of pull some of this back? And you can imagine that taking the form of relatively small things, like, for example, how can we reevaluate the president's statutory authority to declare national emergencies and what the implications of declaring a national emergency is, right? And you can imagine carving that up in various ways and trying to confine that in various ways. But some of it's much bigger in constitutional design ways, and those will be somewhat harder, I think, to pull back. I think that is the challenge we're facing. Yeah, and at the extreme, right, the worry is precisely the one you raised, which is you worry that, in fact, you might empower these institutions so much they're not adequate checks and balances, and there's consequences, there's genuine threats to individual liberties and genuine threats to the way democracy ought to be operating more broadly.
So we have time for 2 more questions.
Yeah.
So political parties haven't changed in a long time.
Yeah.
And I guess what I'm wondering is, since we've
But
had...
they've been changing a lot, but they haven't changed in terms of we got rid of one and started a new one.
Right,
Right.
exactly. And so, to solve this crisis of operation, would it be feasible, or is it likely that that people would change the teams that are playing right now as political actors, factional systems?
So it's a little hard to imagine that we would dramatically change the teams in that sense. In part because of the internal transformations we've seen in parties in the past, it is possible to radically reform pre-existing parties, right? So the thing that runs under the label of Democratic Party might be radically different than the thing that ran under the label of Democratic Party 100 years before, for example. And so the easier path, right, to making those kind of changes doesn't necessarily involve, okay, we're going to start an entirely new party from scratch, and then we'll capture offices and create an organization and all that kind of stuff. Because the cost of getting that off the ground is really tough. But it becomes much easier to capture parties internally, right? Become an insurgent force within a party and then transform what that party is doing and have internal party battles. So strikingly, for example, we've seen that exactly in our present moment, right? Bernie Sanders runs as a senator initially outside the Democratic Party, declares himself being part of another party, and then he runs for president under the Democratic Party label, right? And his supporters eventually become Democrats and are interested internally reforming the party. Donald Trump, a lifelong registered Democrat, right? But now I'm going to run under the party label in which I might have the best chance of actually succeeding. And that happens to be the Republican Party label. And as a consequence, he significantly remakes the Republican Party as a consequence of being successful at that move. So parties don't have a lot of ability to resist those kind of pressures. And so instead, I think of seeing the kind of thing that we saw in the mid-19th century in which the Whig Party disappears and the Republican Party takes its place. Instead, we'll see internal insurgencies that will just remake these parties, and it will just become a different beast with different policy commitments, different constituencies, different interests, different politicians. The teams will be pretty different, but they'll still have the same labels they always have.
One more question?
Yeah.
I hate to have to think all the way home about Trump and Roosevelt being similar, but
And Lincoln, they're all right there.
if the court had said the opposite,
Right.
and Roosevelt had gone ahead and said,
Yeah.
I'm just not going to listen,
Right.
what would have happened?
So I think that I think is the big question on a lot of this stuff, including a lot of these debates we're currently having about norms, for example, right? So the norm completely falls apart, for example, how big of a deal is it? If you completely ignore the U.S. Supreme Court when it makes one of these big rulings, how big a deal is it? Does the court bounce back from that and recovers, and eventually presidents start obeying in other contexts, but it's not going to obey this time? Or is the court permanently damaged such that we weaken the judiciary significantly? And it's hard to know going in, right? And I think one of the big risks you play anytime you're doing these things, whether you're talking in Roosevelt's case of saying, I might have to ignore a very visible judicial order in this very public way, as opposed to all kinds of backdoor sort of behind the scenes minimizing and evading the order, which happens more often. Or we're talking about things like court packing, for example, right? One of the questions you have to risk is okay, what's going to be the long-term implications of having done that? And it's just really hard to predict going in. And I think likewise, it's hard to look in hindsight and say, okay, what would have happened in that context? And part of the answer might have been depends on how Roosevelt played it, right? And so if he followed the recommendation of his attorney general, for example, and just arrested all the justices, that probably looks a little different, right, than some other possible ways you play that dilemma out. But likewise, the Lincoln administration faced its own version of that, right? So Lincoln confronts at the beginning of the Civil War a tawny court that's very hostile to the administration in various ways, and among the things Lincoln is doing is arresting Southern sympathizers in the North and holding them without trial in the judicial process, right? And the tawny court and Roger Taney in particular, prepares opinions in which he's going to issue to the administration saying you're in violation of the habeas corpus clause, you have to bring these people to a court and to demonstrate your lawful authority to hold them. And Lincoln takes a variety of approaches to avoid that problem, right? And one kind of approach you can imagine taking is a very head-on approach of just saying, I don't care what the court says, I'm going to hold these people anyway because the stakes are too big to comply with the court in this case. Another way of trying to do it, it's the way that Lincoln mostly tried to do at the time is, and you could do it given the procedures the court was using at the time, is I'll just move the prisoners around. And such that the court will issue a writ to a warden of a given prison saying, okay, this prisoner you're holding has to be brought to court, and Lincoln moves that prisoner to a different jail such that now you got to track that prisoner down someplace else. And you play that game of forcing the court to try to search for the prisoner as you move him around and evade the jurisdiction of the court. That avoids a head-on confrontation with the court, right? There's a certain attraction to doing it that way, right? But on the other hand, it's also obviously also undermining the court in various ways and has some negative implications for how democracy works and liberty of individuals work in general. So anytime you're sort of confronted with that kind of issue, right, it has serious potential ramifications for how the system plays out in the long term. And if you think the stakes are so high that you have to have that fight in that particular moment, there are also important choices to be made about, okay, how do you have the fight in a way that does the least amount of damage possible to the long-term workings of the system while dealing with this very immediate problem you're confronting now.
But in the short term, the executive gets his or her way virtually every time. He just says, I'm not going to do it.
Frankly, that is the court's worry, right? So one thing the Supreme Court has done over its history is avoid that direct confrontation. The court does not want to issue the order to the president that will be explicitly avoided, which is what the court did in the Gold Clause cases. It's what the court did with the habeas corpus cases in the Lincoln administration as well, and what the court did at various other points in its history as well. And again happened with Roosevelt administration, for example, when Roosevelt, during the early stage of World War II, Roosevelt arrested a bunch of Nazi saboteurs who came to the United States, several of whom were American citizens. And Roosevelt arrested them, put them on trial with military commissions, and then executed them. People litigated on behalf of those prisoners, saying they ought to have a civilian trial, took it to the court, and it was clear the Roosevelt administration was going to ignore any judicial order that told them they couldn't do that in that context. And so the court blinked and declined to issue an order to the Roosevelt administration that would require a civilian trial, and so they were all hung after military trials in that context, right? The court does not want to be in that box of exposing the fact that there's nothing it can really do if the president's not willing to comply with an order. And so the court has to be really cautious about those kinds of confrontations. And the gamble is always, is this the moment we're in where the president might in fact throw down the gauntlet and say, I'm not going to obey? Or in fact, you have some wiggle room here where you can push on the president and he might actually comply here. And you can imagine the court miscalculated on that, right? And thinks it has some wiggle room when it doesn't. And so as a consequence, the president lays down the law in a way that the court doesn't have a good response to. And with potentially quite damaging consequences for the constitutional system more broadly.
Well, yeah, frightening.